Hello there. Well, my big Ampere video that first came out has made quite a few waves. It's actually been interesting to have a front row seat to how some websites and tech tubers handle sourcing information. I'll get into that into the next Broken Silicon. I actually have a lot to say about the state of tech journalism, but the fact of the matter is I was told right after I got that first video out that there'd be a good chance that I would receive more information within a week. And I was actually told this by a couple of sources, but one of them really came through. Put simply, I know basically everything you could want to know about the Ampere lineup, top performance estimates, power usage, more details about the features, and that's what I'm about to get into. But first I want to touch on how hard it is to get information out of Nvidia. Getting information out of Nvidia is not easy. I think anyone, who follows this space closely could guess that when you consider how few leaks there are out of Nvidia compared to AMD, and recently especially Intel. And that's not a coincidence. I won't use a lot of specifics or too many direct quotes here early, and that's because if I did, well, some people could guess who the sources are and which divisions they're located in. Basically, Nvidia locks down test rigs like a maximum security prison. Think multiple anti-tamper devices and some black box software that tracks everything that's being done on the test units. In fact, if you do try to tamper with anything, either through software or physically trying to open up the device, a signal is sent both centrally in Nvidia logging which employee is doing this and all of their system information when it happened, and a software and hardware group will come to your desk and basically make you put your hands up and check everything. This is both, logically to log any problems that may be happening on a test system. I mean, that's their job, is to write drivers and make sure the architecture is stable. But it's also there to watch you like the cops and make sure you weren't doing anything. In fact, I was told that you aren't even really told the full specifics of a card you're working on. You get a vague idea of the die, performance, and power usage, but they won't tell you if this is cut down and which model it's going to be. Very little information is given to any one person, only what they need to know to do their job. What you need to know is that some people went through a lot of effort to get this information here, and in the meantime, while they were getting it, I've compiled some other independent information from other sources, including information about RDNA 2, so that we can come to a robust conclusion about what's probably going to happen at the end of this year when AMD and Nvidia duke it out. I will say one more thing. Basically, there's no way to modify through software anything you're doing on a GPU right now at Nvidia. In other words, overclocking, of course not, and GPU-Z cannot read the proprietary test BIOS they have. So this is just an FYI. If you see any GPU-Z leaks of Ampere, unless it's like a month before the cards come out, they're probably all fake. I think that's some useful information. But let's get into it, shall we? I'm going to go through GA102 and then everything else. And with GA102, let's start with how the card looks. Now, before I get into the information, it's important to note that this is information as of now for engineering samples and other little things circulating around in NVIDIA's headquarters. Things are subject to change, but as of now, the engineering sample looks a lot like a 20 Series Founders Edition, but this time with 3 fans for greater cooling and quieter operation. Additionally, the design has been simplified, that's a quote, with less screws on the back of the card. I'm suspecting these things will be easier to do maintenance on compared to the nightmare that was the Turing Founders Editions. Now, another big thing that you can see on the outside of the card is 2 8-pins. The engineering sample for the equivalent Turing card had 3. Now, I know that no final cards had 3, but they typically beef up the specs of these engineering samples to keep them stable while you're testing them. Nonetheless, the fact that this has less than the previous engineering samples should tell you that Ampere cards indeed will be using less energy than the Turing equivalents they will replace, even with the enhanced specs. I say should, though, because I do feel Nvidia may push some of their models harder than intended when they try to compete with RDNA 2.0. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The rear I/O comes with 5 ports, 3 DisplayPort 2.0, 1 HDMI 2.1 for 10K support, and a USB-C as well. Also, it is PCIe 4.0. I think everyone expected this, but now I can officially confirm it for you all. Now, like I said, before I get to the next slide, Nvidia has their own monitoring software that doesn't tell you specifics. No way to know core count, die size, process, or memory vendor for the card you're working on, but you can see things like voltage requirements, power usage, and other things like memory speed that tell us what this card likely is. But well, I'm saying all this to just remind you, exact core configs for each model could remain a guarded secret all the way up to launch. Nvidia isn't screwing around with Ampere. They don't want AMD to know what they're working on. But I do know what they're working on. As rumored, GA102's die should go up to 5,376 CUDA cores. Now, we don't know how much they will cut it down, but that's quite the increase when you consider it's using 220 to 230 watts, and that the card boosts to 2.2 gigahertz. Even cut down, the card should exceed 21 teraflops in performance, and this model has 18 gigabit per second memory, suggesting they beefed it up from the other rumors that were 16 gigabits per second. On paper, this thing will have at least 40% more bandwidth than the 2080 Ti before you take into account things like enhanced memory compression and Tensor accelerated VRAM. Now, GA103 and 104 could apparently boost up to 2.5 gigahertz, but this is not confirmed, although expected by the engineer. And the card hits massive CPU bottlenecks at 1080p and 1440p. For the love of God, stop gaming on 1080p with these monster cards. It's time for 4K to become the mid-range standard, and honestly, I do think it will when you see the performance numbers. Worst case scenario in the tests being run on games, this 3080 Ti is getting rasterization performance 40% stronger than the 2080 Ti in 4K in unfavorable, and that's quoted, games. However, usually it is at least 50% faster than the 2080 Ti and up to 70% faster in some titles. Now, for me, this is incredibly exciting as a PC gamer. You know, a 40 to 70% performance lift across the board for Ampere. Yeah, this should be bigger than what Turing was over Pascal. And in fact, I think this could overall be a bigger deal than Pascal over Maxwell. This is the performance increase we need to make 4K a no-drama mainstream standard, and it should coincide with 4K monitor prices, even 120Hz ones, coming down in price quite a bit. But this performance level actually brings me to something I want to address that I saw in the comments a lot from the previous video, and that's people acting like it's crazy when I suggested that the 3060 may perform a lot like a 2080 Ti. What you got to do is put this generation in perspective. If the 3080 Ti is, let's say, 50% stronger than the 2080 Ti, just to make the math easy, then I don't know why you would assume the other cards in the lineup won't be 50% stronger than the cards they're replacing before you even take into account ray tracing. And if it is 50% better, well, look, guys, the top half of the Turing lineup doesn't perform that differently per segment. Actually, let me show you specifically. I'm just going to go to the latest Tech Power Up review of a modern graphics card, a 2070 Super KO. As you would expect, you know, it's just below the 2080, but if we go above that Vega 64, we can see the 2060 right there. So let's multiply the 2060's performance by 1.5, 111, and we get, well, yeah, 111 just behind 113, just behind a 2080 Super. And that's something I like to emphasize that most people don't seem to get. Forget the price performance difference between the 5700 XT and the 2070 Super. I think what's more insane is that a $350 5700 XT is only 30% weaker than a $1,200 2080 Ti. All of these top cards, there's like a dozen of them, are within the same two tiers of performance. And so I don't know what to tell you, right? I mean, if you bought a 2080 Ti around launch in 2018, at least maybe you get about 2 years out of it. If you didn't have those early launch problems most people seem to have. And if you bought it recently, I don't know. I'm sorry, right? Like, if Ampere is 50% stronger across the board. Then the 3080 Ti will be stronger, the 3080 will be stronger, the 3070 will be stronger, and likely something like a 3060 Ti or 3060 Super, and maybe even the 3060 when you consider superior DLSS and RT performance, will beat that $1,200 2080 Ti. Sorry, Turing buyers. Turing was a guinea pig generation. Ampere is the next Pascal. And look, let's also put this into perspective. Let's say the 3060 is a little weaker than the 2080 Super. The information I've just received on ray tracing performance suggests that even lower mid-range Ampere cards could vastly outperform the highest end Turing cards. Actually, yeah, let's get to it. Let's get to the boatload of information I have now about Ampere ray tracing performance. Now, the cliff notes aren't changing much from the previous video, but the details themselves are fascinating, and I do have some exact performance numbers. Anyways, on Ampere, the amount of RT cores supposedly per SM isn't what's necessarily changing. The big deal is how much more performant they are each beam. Ampere RT cores, compared to Turing, can process intersections at 4 times faster than Turing can. So, if you made a 2080 Ti, hypothetically, with Ampere architecture core RT cores, it would theoretically do ray tracing 4 times better. When you account for the additional SMs, the enhanced L2 cache, and the doubling of tensor cores for denoising in Ampere, low-end Ampere could run circles around high-end Turing in games with RT on. Turing will age like Kepler, I'll say it again. They won't mandate any low RT settings for old cards, according to a source. They are going to, in fact, conversely, crank up ray tracing in games that they fund to make you want to upgrade. Turing had to choose between global illumination, shadows, and reflections, and then you would get a massive performance loss no matter which one you were running. Ampere can do them all at the same time and with greater fidelity and less of a performance loss. You know, Jensen Huang marketed Turing as it just works, but it clearly didn't when you saw the performance. Ampere may just work. You just turn it on and you have devs who don't have to worry about programming specific types of ray tracing to keep performance intact, and it doesn't really lower rasterization performance. For example, in Minecraft RTX, GA102 was 4 to 5 times faster than the Titan RTX. There you go. You do the math on how good the 3060 will be then versus the Titan. And while we're here, why don't I just remind you of the overall information, because some of it has been updated. Expect a solid IPC increase over Turing, although before I said 10 to 20%. I did some rough math on the outdated 8nm info and compared it to what I have for 7, and I gotta say, I think it's closer to the lower end of that estimate. It could even be a little less than 10%. But again, all I know is it's a substantial increase. It's not a giant one, but it's substantial. It's not tiny. And that comes from double the L2 cache. Now, like I said, higher core clocks. I said above 1900 megahertz before. Well, now I'm saying basically above 2 gigahertz on cards that are 7 nanometer EUV. And at this point, it seems entirely obvious that most of the high-end lineup should be on 7 nanometer EUV with those clocks. And I'll have more to say about this in a few minutes. DLSS 3.0 will be better than DLSS 2.0, but I am told now that it isn't some magic performance boost. It should work in any game with TAA, but a game-ready driver is still required from Nvidia. It doesn't just work, and devs will still need to do some specific programming per game to get it to work, but it should be much easier to implement before with better results. Results will vary wildly, but the overall average quality is better. So again, what I'm basically saying is that DLSS isn't a silver bullet, but it will be something Nvidia markets really hard. In fact, I've been told that they're considering overriding settings in some games so you have to have it turned on with certain cards, and that they really will be pushing benchmarking sites to utilize it, well, as often as possible. NVCache is coming, by the way, and it is Nvidia's answer to high bandwidth cache, but I have further details compared to before. It leverages both your DDR and SSD for enhanced load times in VRAM. And specifically, I was told it can dynamically utilize the bandwidth between the allocation you put on an SSD, the VRAM, and DDR for multiple tasks at the same time. An example I was given is you have more than enough bandwidth from a fast SSD to run YouTube, so if you're running a game at the same time, it may not even disturb the GDR6 and may pull bandwidth from the SSD, kind of similar to the next-gen consoles, and use that to run different apps, and it may combine all of them for specific games. This is a very big deal, bigger than high bandwidth cache if this is true. Additionally, Tensor memory compression. It actually uses the tensor cores to actively compress and decompress items stored in VRAM, and it's not magic either. It is still being optimized, and you do have to toggle it on, right, if you want it to be used, because there could be slight performance losses. But if, let's say, you have a 6 gigabyte card and you want to play in 4K with that 3060 maybe, well, it can shave 20 to 40% off of VRAM usage. Specifically, having a 12 gigabyte Ampere card, although you might lose a 5% or 10% performance while turning this on, it should behave like a 16 gigabyte card. No 50% performance losses from running out of VRAM anymore. It would now be like 5 to 10%. And let's round this all out. RTX from top to bottom, like I said before, all cards should have Tensor and RT. HPC is going to be announced in May, as we all know, in a few days, and September for gamers. Press drivers are expected to be ready for Cyberpunk's release. So whether it's a paper launch or not, that's when we're going to see its performance. And no confirmation again on exactly when high volume will be out there. Nvidia wants these out as soon as possible either way, though. And again, expect an overhauled control panel, merging GeForce Experience with GeForce Now. They want to catch up with how Catalyst is organized, no more login required, RTX voice is being enhanced, and all of the other things I said as well. And now that I have these extra details, it's safe to say that I'm officially amped for Ampere. And not just for the extra ray tracing and gaming rasterization performance, although that's always fun, but for these prosumer advantages. I mean, NVCache sounds legitimately impressive, but most of all, I'm excited that I believe we are seeing in Nvidia that's forced to be far more aggressive than it has been in, well, probably over a decade. And many of you are probably wondering, why? Why is Nvidia being so aggressive? I thought AM dead and Radeon can't compete. Well, I might do an entire video about what's going on behind the scenes, but until I have time for that, I have to at least touch on it to make this video complete, in my opinion. What is going on that's scaring Nvidia so much, and why was there all of this hubbub about an 8 nanometer and a 7 nanometer? Well, the first things we need to establish is what would have never changed, and two things I believe would have never changed. Number one, the top card, the 8000 CUDA core monster with HBM that would cost over 10 grand, was always going to be on TSMC's 7 nanometer EUV. But they didn't need to get millions of these things off the production line right away, and a lot of it was just about prestige. However, the second thing is there's no way they could put all of their cards on TSMC, not with AMD buying up all the capacity and not in a way that would allow them to keep their fat profit margins. So what happened is honestly pretty simple. Nvidia designed the lineup you see here, and I believe the top cards, at least GA100 and 102, were initially always designed to be made on either Samsung or TSMC, or maybe both depending on what they wanted to do. But the ones below GA102, your GA103s, 104s, and so on, these were meant for Samsung unless they could get TSMC to lower prices in a bidding war, and unless they heard that RDNA 2 was more powerful than they expected. And this strategy is actually something I'm all too familiar with working in the automotive industry. You have two suppliers for similar components, or effectively the same component, and you tell the other one, oh, you have someone bidding against you, and if you don't lower the price, well, we'll just go to them. That is what Nvidia tried to do to TSMC, and they figured we've got this one locked up anyways. As long as AMD's top consumer card doesn't trade blows with a 3080 Ti, well, who cares, right? Maybe on Samsung the 3080 Ti would just be, 20% better than AMD's top card and use more energy than it should, but that's good enough, and Samsung's offering us basically half the cost per wafer. Let's just go with them. In fact, I believe Nvidia was throwing around the idea of introducing an RTX 3090, something in between an 80 Ti and a Titan. It would likely be a slightly cut down 102 with the full 12 gigabytes of VRAM for probably around $1,500, and then they would lower the price of a more cut down 102 to $1,000 for an 11 gigabyte 3080 Ti. Indeed, I think Nvidia's initial conception of the RTX 3000 series was indeed something with better price performance increases than Turing brought over Pascal for sure, but you know, they removed the GTX series. Okay, well that's an excuse to convince you it's okay their RTX 2050 Ti is now 250. After all, it's not GTX, it's RTX. So of course it's okay the 50 Ti is now 250. And sure, the 3060 may be 330 to 350, but I think they would have kept 6 gigabytes even in 2020, and so on and so forth. Thus, more aggressive than Turing, but still finding little ways to nudge up prices, like introducing a 3090 for $1,500 that is really what a Titan should cost, not a cut down card with just 12 gigabytes of VRAM in 2020. But I don't really think that's going to happen. I could be entirely wrong, but it seems like this plan to bully TSMC into lower prices has massively backfired, as I retweeted a retired engineer report from DigiTimes. In this report, it details how Nvidia had massively underestimated how much AMD and TSMC were becoming fond partners of each other, and that TSMC did not budge on their threats, and now they are going to be forced to switch more of their components over TSMC's 7nm EUV than they initially intended, and that they may have to accept delays for Ampere all the way into Q1 for a lot of the lineup. And I say more of the lineup than they initially intended because it is clear to me Nvidia has realized that they underestimated RDNA 2.0 and that they can't just skate by making the top 1 to 2 dies on TSMC's 7nm EUV. And how strong will RDNA 2.0 be? Well, I've been very outspoken that I believe the top RDNA 2 card, no matter the efficiency, should be about 50% stronger than a 2080 Ti. And I base this on the fact that they're literally calling it Navi 2X, and that we know the top card supposedly will use at least 300 watts, but that AMD has a 50% performance per watt efficiency gain with RDNA 2 over RDNA 1. And actually now I have some additional small but very tangible insider details about RDNA 2.0. I am told that Big Navi early samples from a few months ago were beating the 2080 Ti by around 10%. Now at first this sounds very unimpressive until you consider this source also told me these samples were clocked incredibly low, like they were mobility cards, and that the ultimate top performance of Big Navi was going to come down to how much AMD could ramp up clock speed. Nvidia, of course, would have had access to this information from some of their sources, and I believe they just got cocky. They assumed AMD was unlikely to get a substantially larger die with RDNA 2 architecture to clock much higher than a 5700 XT, you know, around 1.8 to 1.9 gigahertz. And with TSMC saying things like we don't expect much faster clock speeds after 7nm, even with half node shrinks on EUV, I can see why Nvidia thought this. But here's the thing. I'm sure they started to get worried when they saw the Xbox Series X get announced, clearly using less than 300 watts overall, with 40% more compute units than the 5700 XT has. And keep in mind, this is powering 8 cores and a bunch of other components as well, thus suggesting that the graphics card portion of this console was likely using the same amount of energy as the 5700 XT, while bringing it for around 30 to 40% more performance. Clearly, AMD had fixed RDNA's power draw. And if that wasn't worrisome enough for Nvidia, you know, they may go, okay, so they fixed the power draw, but we should still easily get top performance if we make massive dies on an older node. It worked for us before with Turing. But then they saw Mark Cerny announced the PlayStation 5 would clock to 2.2 gigahertz. AMD had simply fixed RDNA. And yeah, the PlayStation 5 may use some pretty extravagant cooling solutions, but AMD's never been afraid to slap a liquid cooler on their top card if they think it will allow them to compete with the top performance crown. Nvidia had underestimated AMD, and they had overplayed their cards when they tried to force TSMC's pricing down. Now, and this is what I believe is going on currently, they're just going to have to pay higher prices, accept a 1/4 delay and limited availability at launch for top Ampere. For Nvidia, this decision was the lesser of two evils, right? Think about their choices here. No matter what, AMD is resurgent, and so they had to decide, well, if we put most of our lineup on Samsung 8nm, we'll have plenty of capacity and we can keep prices lower. But once we lower prices, once we allow AMD to take the performance crown, even if the Titan technically keeps it, no one's going to buy that really. Well, then from now on, we may never be able to raise prices again if RDNA 3 is just as competitive. So I guess we'll just have limited availability at launch with TSMC's 7nm EUV, if that means we can keep close to Turing's prices and hopefully take back the crown more comprehensively and sooner. And so what do I think's going to happen late 2020? Well, I think there's no way around it. AMD's more likely than Nvidia to get a more comprehensive lineup out to consumers first. So I believe Nvidia may rush out a Titan beforehand, and to be clear, I do have a source that tells me that Nvidia is accelerating their Titan release schedule to try to cling to the performance crown technically. So yeah, I think maybe, just maybe, we'll see some type of Titan Ampere paper launch, not based on GA102 by the way, but I do believe based on GA100. Might be $3,000, but Nvidia can claim the performance win. And then they're just gonna try to get their full lineup out as soon as they can, but it's probably going to come a quarter after RDNA 2.0 launches, and that means I think that, at least in the mainstream performance crown, AMD might actually take it for a few months. And this isn't just a threat to Nvidia's gaming market share, which they were disappointed with how Turing did, it's also a threat to their professional machine learning market share, as I am told RDNA 2 is going to surprise people with how good it is at machine learning. And thus, I just don't think Nvidia is going to screw around. Basically, compared to their initial plans, I think they've been forced to switch half of their lineup to a superior node and bump the specs up a tier for just about every segment. I think GA102 will go into the 3080 Ti and not be cut down that much, with 12 gigabytes of 18 gigabit per second memory. And I believe above that, the Titan will actually have HBM and be tremendously good at ray tracing. And below that, I think we'll just get a 10 gigabyte 3080 that gives the Titan RTX a run for its money at everything, and the entire lineup should be more competitive than ever before, which means, that's right, I'm going to show this thumbnail again. As I've said in multiple videos, I believe the end of this year, 2020, is going to be the most competitive year in gaming graphics that we've seen for a decade, that this will be comparable to the Kepler versus GCN moment where they were swapping crowns back and forth for a while. However, I'm not convinced we're going to get back to, Kepler GCM pricing where we had $500 80 cards. No, I don't. For that to happen, AMD would have to take the top crown, not just for a week and not just for consumers, but the overall complete performance crown for months, like they've done before with the 5870 and 7970. And who knows, maybe that will be RDNA 3.0 a year and a half from now. But either way, competition is back. Well, I hope you enjoyed this mega video. It was quite a lot of work, but I had a lot of fun doing it, and I will have a lot of fun covering all of the upcoming products this year. I really think this year will be the most exciting product launches when it comes to gaming tech since, well, I think my entire lifetime, even before like 2010. I think this year and next year are going to be insane. But I do want to say this too. Please share this video, and it takes a lot of effort to make videos like this. I'm not the only one who does this. There's other people like Adore TV, Cortex, Gamers Nexus, and Red Gaming Tech. And, I think sometimes we run into trouble. Well, we don't know how to handle how some tech sites and other tech tubers don't give proper credit. I think it's pretty pretentious to assume you were the first to say something. I don't think the solution is putting exclusive all over all of our videos. No, I think the solution is just telling our fans, people, you watching this video, to demand better from other tech sites. When you see, someone like Tweaktown link to my channel, to my video, and give me proper credit, that's great. But someone needs to say something. When you see a tech tuber put no links in the description and only say my name in passing quickly, it's just unacceptable. It's not hard to put a quick link to the people who compiled this information, who did all of the digging. And so to my fans, to the fans of similar channels, demand better if you want us to grow and succeed. And again, if you want us to succeed, I just wanted to say that quickly. Also, make sure you, of course, subscribe to my YouTube channel. And also, subscribe to Broken Silicon Podcast on your favorite or preferred podcast app. The next episode, of course, is going to go through tons of reader mails and discussions with all of the recent leaks, this, Zen 4, Zen 3 Plus, all these leaks that I've managed to get out in just 2 weeks. And then there will be a loose ends at the end of this week, so stay tuned for that. Otherwise, thank you for watching.